Today. My name is Christian Lewis. I'm the president of the Maine Trial Lawyers Association. We've got a really great topic today. It's one that is timely given the record sales of bicycles in the state of Maine in the past couple of weeks, actually all across the U.S. in the past couple of weeks. If any of you have been to a bicycle shop, there is no stock. They can't get new ones. They've sold everything they have, which means there are more folks out on the roads biking right now. A lot of folks have dusted off the old mountain bike that was in the basement, and they've decided to get some exercise while they're quarantined. And unfortunately, that's going to result in more of these issues, encounters between bicycles and automobiles. And there are just a lot of really novel issues that are coming up these days with e-bikes, with scooters. Anyone who's been to some of the cities that have scooter share programs, it's fascinating to see how they work, to see how the business model works. We're very lucky today to have Lori Boxer-McComber, who's a partner at Kelly Remble Zimmerman, Bob O'Brien, who is a partner at Noyes, Hall, and Allen Insurance, and Rick McAllister, who's the president of the Crash Lab. A lot of you probably know Rick, either through working with him or having him on the other side of you. He does an excellent job with accident reconstructionism. With accident reconstructions, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they all have to say. So without any further ado, I just want to say thank you again. I'm looking forward to this presentation, and I hope you are as well. Lori?
Yes, good morning. Hello, everyone. As Chris just mentioned, I am Lori Boxer-McComber, and I practice bicycle and pedestrian law with the law firm of Kelly Remble Zimmerman. And I'm also part of a national network where a lot of us work on proactive policy, bicycle legislation, in addition to kind of the reactive side of things, when people are involved in crashes and the like. So I'm fortunate enough to have a client base of people that are really wonderful, engaging people to work with that have been unfortunately involved in horrific traffic trauma, and happy to share with all of you some of the things that I've learned as someone practicing in this area, and some of the tips for investigating these types of cases. So today's agenda, I'm gonna click down here. Let me see, hold on a second. Today's agenda is going to start with kind of a fun little transportation game, kind of a refresher on a lot of traffic laws that some of you may have encountered if you've had these types of cases before in the past. And it's a game called Is This Legal? And Jim Tassi of the Bicycle Coalition of Maine and I developed this presentation for the Prosecutors Conference a couple of years ago, where we presented on bicycle law. And I've kind of modified it, added some pedestrian laws into this, added some other laws into it. So basically the way this is going to work is I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to start with some low-hanging fruits, and Steve's going to send out a poll, and you're going to quickly, within 10 to 20 seconds, just give me your gut reaction on whether what you're seeing in the picture is legal. And then we'll talk about it. And in the handouts, I go into detail about the statutes that apply to these situations. So if the game moves a little quickly, know that you have the resource, the written resource, available to you after the presentation. And of course, I'm available as a resource as well. After we go through that is this legal game. We're going to jump into crash investigation and case assessment. Rick of the Crash Lab, Rick McAllister of the Crash Lab, is really going to be the one diving into the details because he often serves as an expert in these cases. I'm going to run through the checklist that I passed out to you, but again, my portion of the presentation is going to be pretty abbreviated, and we're going to take advantage of having the expert here. And most of what I have to say is included in the written materials, but again, always happy to supplement later on. Then after we talk about crash investigation, we're gonna touch on insurance issues, and we're fortunate enough to have Bob O'Brien here, who has been starting, one of the people here in Maine who's been starting to address some of the questions that are coming up with respect to e-bikes and other new forms of transportation and coverage issues that are arising in those. So Bob's going to speak to that. And then if we've got time, I will share some information about some of the really exciting movements that are taking place within our state, and and we'll do questions and answers. So with that, let's get started on the Is It Legal game. So first photo here, and like I said, we're starting basic. No helmet, is this legal? So Steve's gonna send out a poll and very quickly, within 10 seconds, give me your answer of whether this is legal. Steve? Did everyone get a poll?
Well, I'm not getting any results, Lori. Let's try this again.
I am not seeing a poll.
Okay, hang on 1 second here. Let's see if we can retry this.
And if we're having technical difficulties, I'm happy to just move on. we can just talk about the law.
Okay. I'm sorry, Lori, for whatever reasons, I'm having difficulties with the poll.
Let's just move forward, and everyone can kind of go on the honor system with themselves. So in the state of Maine, this is lawful. This person is above 16 years old. So in Maine, the law is that if you're under 16, you need to have a helmet on. And if you're above, you can go without. And for those of you who are practitioners, attorneys, know that in civil and criminal proceedings, the fact of someone not wearing a helmet is not something that's admissible in the proceedings. So that's an interesting thing, because sometimes, emergency room records are going to have reference to the fact that someone might not have been wearing a helmet. But we do have some motorcycle case law that's pretty clear about helmets and the fact of non-use being kept out of the civil or criminal proceeding. We don't have that any precedent yet in the bicycle world, but there is some very clear guidance in the motorcycle world. Oh, and one thing that I was going to show that's kind of interesting these days, with the rise of rideshare programs in other parts of the country, and we're starting to get them here in Maine. When I say a rideshare, I'm talking about bicycle share programs where you can unlock a bike off the street using your phone or some other device. A lot of people are not wearing helmets, and this is a helmet that I got from Lime. And it's being distributed in Europe, and it's a foldable helmet. So they're starting to make it much easier for people to have helmets and be able to use the bike shares. And so this is kind of a fun new thing that is out there. We haven't yet started seeing it in the United States, but it's happening in Europe. All right, next slide. How about this one? Is this legal? Passing on the right. Steve, are we going to try the poll, or are we skipping poll?
Yeah, I think we should skip the poll.
Okay, so we've got a bicyclist passing on the right. Is this legal? Give everyone a second to think about that. And the answer is that in Maine, it is lawful to pass on the right, but as we have a case that specifically says that you can do so, and that you're not barred from later on bringing a legal action if you are injured doing it. But you're passing at your own risk, meaning you have to take into consideration the whole context of the situation, and you're assuming the risk that perhaps someone may not see you. So I see this coming up in cases. I have it in a case right now where someone who was making a left-hand turn in front of an oncoming lane, and the bicyclist was passing on the right, and they're saying, well, the bicyclist is at fault for getting hit. My response to a lot of these is that riding is very contextual. There are lots of times when the safest thing for a bicyclist to do is to move up to the front of a line of traffic. So if you're at, for example, at a red light on Marginal Way in Portland, sometimes the safest thing to do if there's a red light is to get up to the front, make sure that oncoming traffic in the opposing lane of traffic sees you, so that when that light turns green, everyone knows you're there. Other times it's the safest thing is to take, control of the travel lane. And so it's very contextual, but the long and short of it is there's a case, the Semyon versus Ledgmore transportation case, that makes it very clear that you can pass on the right and that you're not barred from bringing a claim. And the statute simply says that you're going to weigh things the way you would in any other comparative negligence analysis. So how about this one? Here, what I want you to look at is the motor vehicle operators' actions. Is this lawful? The answer on this is no. This is an unsafe pass because basically the car is squeezing the bicycle over to an unsafe place on the roadway, not leaving the bicyclist a full 3 feet. One thing that is coming up a lot for those of you that may practice in this area, and you don't see it in this particular photo, but a lot of these big trucks have huge mirrors that extend off the vehicle, and those need to be kept 3 feet away from the bicyclist as well. I'm starting to see some head injuries and other injuries due to the mirrors that are not kept 3 feet away from the bicyclist. And likewise, if a vehicle is pulling another vehicle, that boat or whatever it may be has to be kept 3 feet away from the bicyclist as well. And I think a couple of years ago there was a professor at UMaine who was injured because there was some type of a garden tool that was hanging off a truck. And so it's not just the vehicle itself, it's all the accessories and things that it carries with it that need to be kept 3 feet away. In Maine, there's a specific statute, and there's actually a presumption that if you actually strike, if there's a collision between a motor vehicle and a bicyclist, it's presumed to be an unsafe pass, and the burden then shifts over to the driver to show that it wasn't, which is great because we're one of the only states that has that. That was something that we worked on with the Bicycle Coalition in Maine years ago, and is unique to our law. Other states have graduated passing statutes. So for example, in New Hampshire, if you're traveling 40 miles an hour, you have to leave 4 feet. If you're traveling 50, you have to leave 5 feet and the like. And so in Maine, the thing to keep in mind is even though our law says 3 feet, if you're driving a logging truck or a huge vehicle, sometimes your actual standard of care is to leave more than 3 feet because of the effect of that large vehicle that it can have on the operation of a bicycle. So means this is, a typical sign that you see now. In the past, we used to see share the road signs, which led to lots of confusion because a lot of people believed that meant bicyclists should share with the cars, and that encouraged a lot of unsafe passing. So this is how the DOT addressed it. And you'll see these signs replacing the old share the road signs these days. How about this one? A motor vehicle operator kind of turning in front of a bicyclist who's operating on the public way. Is that lawful? And obviously the answer is, it is not. In this case, this is called a right hook. This happens all the time. Unfortunately, a lot of people that are driving motor vehicles believe that a bicyclist is probably traveling 5 to 8 miles an hour when the bicyclist may be traveling 25 miles an hour. And so they make an unsafe turn in front of the bicyclist, not giving the bicyclist enough time to perceive and react to that turn. And even if they throw on a blinker, the time distance doesn't work in favor of the bicyclist. And so there is an explicit statute saying that you may not turn near a bicyclist when you're going to interfere with the safe operation of the bicyclist. So that's the right hook. Another situation that I was just talking about, was the left turn in front of cyclists. So often there's a vehicle coming from the opposing lane of traffic. And even if there is no line of traffic there, often drivers are, so even if there are no motor vehicles blocking the view of a bicyclist, a lot of motor vehicles are only looking for motor vehicle traffic, and they're not looking for bicyclists or pedestrians. So, you know, a very common thing that we all see is motor vehicle operators making a left-hand turn, particularly at the end of a light cycle. Like it may be, you know, that they haven't been able to make their left-hand turn because you've got a green light, a solid green light, and they've been waiting to make that turn. And the bicyclist is at the end of the light cycle going through the intersection, and the person turning left is going through the intersection and trying to make their turn, and they often will nail the bicyclist at a high rate of speed. So that is something, unfortunately, that we're seeing a lot of. How about this one? Bicyclist operation. Is this lawful? So obviously in Maine, we've got lighting requirements. So you want, and on your handouts, I have all the details about the lighting requirements, but, and they're on page 3, under number 5. But basically you need to have a front light that emits a light that's visible for 200 feet. And in the back, you have to have either a light or a reflector. So you are not required to have a light in the back, but it has to be a light or a reflector visible from 200 feet to the rear. And you have to have something reflective on your pedals or on your feet. A lot of bicyclists remove their pedals. If you've worked with the bicyclists that do this as a sport, a lot of them remove the pedals, have clip-ins, so those people technically should be having something on their feet that is reflective or have lights on their feet. So that's an example of someone who's got all that stuff on. And you'll hear from Rick on this later, but one of the key things that we want to do if you're a bicyclist is be recognizable. And so a lot of people who are human factors experts have said that our brains as drivers recognize the movement, the up and down movement of a pedal. So one of the most important things bicyclists can do is have something on their feet or moving parts of their bodies that make that biomotion recognizable to drivers. And so in cases where you're defending or bringing a case on behalf of a bicyclist where they have this, it's very helpful because you know they've been following all the rules. So you need to have lights and reflectors per the statute in any time that it's not daytime per the statute, and then or during the nighttime, and the statute says you do this during the nighttime. Nighttime means any time other than daytime. It's typical Maine statutory law. So then you go to daytime. Daytime means any time from a half hour before sunrise to a half hour after sunset. Obviously, you know, the earlier you put them on, the better. But that's the law. All right, sidewalk riding. And we're seeing a lot of this now with the pandemic because we have all sorts of riders on Main public ways, and a lot of them feel more comfortable on the sidewalk, whether it's right or wrong. That's where a lot of them want to be. So question is it legal? And the answer under Maine law is that under the statutory code, under Title 29A, there's nothing that prohibits sidewalk riding. So There's no law saying that you can't sidewalk ride. Then you turn to local ordinances, and cities and towns vary on what they want. Some encourage sidewalk riding. You can see it in some of their planning documents. They've decided that they want roads to be for cars, and they encourage people by road design or otherwise to ride on the sidewalk. Others explicitly say no sidewalk riding for anyone under a specific age. For anyone over a specific age. So they allow it for children, but they don't allow it for adults. Other towns say you can't ride in specific districts. So like, for example, in the city of Portland, it's by sign. If over by the Nickelodeon, for example, if there are signs up that say no biking and skateboards, you can't ride over there, but you may be able to ride on High Street on the sidewalk. So sidewalk riding, people vary on whether it's safe, but we have a lot of elderly people here in the state of Maine, and we have a lot of disabled people here in the state of Maine. We have a lot of people that are not comfortable riding on a 50-mile-an-hour road where there's distracted driving going on. And so people are making calculated decisions to sometimes ride on sidewalks. And as drivers, what I always stress when I'm doing these cases is drivers have a duty to be looking for people in all places. And so if they're coming in and out of a Hannaford or a Lowe's hardware parking lot or whatever, they should be looking to the sidewalks for people, because people occupy public ways, and they shouldn't just be looking in one direction or the other. And just like some cities and towns discourage sidewalk riding. Here's a sign I took this photo when I was in Auburn. I have a sign problem. I'm always taking photos of signs, but in Auburn, they're encouraging everyone to ride on the sidewalks, and they even ask that the bicyclist essentially use the pedestrian signal. Obviously, if you're a winter commuter, things aren't looking good for you on the sidewalk, but there's a sign in a place where they are encouraging sidewalk riding. Next photo, this is, I'm just checking time here. So this is a photo of someone riding against traffic, meaning the motor vehicle traffic is traveling in the opposite direction. This under Maine law is generally not acceptable. Sometimes there's infrastructure built or bike lanes built that allow for you to travel in an unusual way, but for the most part under Maine law, this is unlawful. Here's something that we're seeing a lot of too, also during the pandemic. It's not necessarily with U-Haul trucks, but I started to see a lot of this after Maine passed its distracted driving law, the hands-free law. People start pulling over with their big vehicles or their small vehicles onto the bike lane all over the place or onto the shoulder of the roadway. So this is also something that's unlawful, but that is happening way too much. And the vehicles are making it dangerous for bicyclists and pushing them out into the travel lane. So sometimes you have these cases where a vehicle either stops or pulls over or pulls back out into traffic without taking into consideration all traffic. They're just thinking about other motor vehicle operators. And I saw this little ad, but if people think it's no big deal, but how would you like it if we just parked our bikes? If you're a bicyclist, you park your bike in the middle of someone else's travel lane. And so given the fact that we have same rights, same responsibilities in most cases in Maine, it's important to acknowledge that, people can't be parking in one user's space and thinking it's no big deal. Here's another situation. This is what is referred to as dooring. A lot of you probably know about this. This is something that is coming up more often with the rise of Uber and Lyft. Passengers in Uber and Lyft vehicles often are opening their doors to get out in random spots, and you do serious damage to a bicyclist. So people that get injured in these crashes are usually getting pretty bad head and other injuries. What's fascinating, so this is not lawful to open your door on traffic. There is a statute, it's the parking statute, and I put it in your materials. It's under, let's see, it's under number 12 on page 6 of your materials. That's the statute that prohibits people from opening their doors on moving traffic. So when you get these types of cases, you want to be looking at all sorts of insurance. You want to be looking at it to see if there was a ride share going on and whether Uber or Lyft coverage applies. You want to be looking at if the passenger opened the door, maybe the passenger's homeowner's insurance. And you also want to be looking at the driver's insurance. So very interesting. What's fascinating about these cases is that law enforcement officers are not always writing these up as crash reports. They often write them up as incident reports, and you have a much harder time getting insurance information from the get-go. You have a much harder time getting the names of the people involved. So just something to keep in mind. It's very fascinating, this particular type of case within that area. So is this one legal? This here we've got a bicyclist that is choosing or riding not on the far right of the roadway. And the answer is yes. Oops, we'll not go to that one yet. So in Maine, the law on where a bicycle may ride is found under section 2063 of the Motor Vehicle and Traffic Code. And there are a number of situations where bicyclists are not required to ride to the far right. In this particular case, you have a line of traffic that's turning right, and this bicyclist probably is going straight. So they've assumed their position in the lane to make it clear that they're going straight and not turning right. Otherwise, they could end up getting injured by someone as they tried to move straight instead of going right with the flow of traffic. It would create a much harder situation for them. Likewise, if the bicyclist was avoiding objects on the side of the road or making a turn or whatever it may be, there are a number of different exceptions. And we'll talk about those in a second. This one, this is an interesting photo. When I gave this talk to the AARP a couple of years ago, a bunch of senior citizens went crazy. They all wanted to spend time talking about this photo because I think this often will incite road rage for people. They see a group of bicyclists and they think, why are those people all occupying my travel lane and why can't I drive and why are they in my way? So the first question is this legal when we're looking at the bicyclist's actions? And then the second question that this photo presents is the driver, is that legal for them to pass in a no passing zone? So with respect to the bicyclists, again, in our attorney world, the answer is often it depends. If these bicyclists, we don't see exactly what's ahead, but if these bicyclists are all preparing to make a left-hand turn, this might be the safest thing for them to do. They're grouping up together and they're acting as one, unit versus spreading out and having, 40 bicyclists that a driver has to safely pass. So if they're getting ready, preparing to make a turn, this might be lawful. If they're traveling the normal speed of traffic, this is absolutely lawful. If in a number of situations, and it doesn't exist here, if they're avoiding hazards on the roadway and they think that the safest way to manage the roadway at that point in time is to discourage passing, it may be lawful as well. So it's very contextual whether something is lawful or not. Many towns and cities also have ordinances that talk about whether you can ride two abreast or more than two abreast. And the question with those ordinances is whether they're actually lawful, and it hasn't been tested yet, but you have to actually pass that ordinance and have that ordinance passed in a specific way in order for it to eclipse the statute on point. And so Cape Elizabeth, for example, has a statute about not riding two abreast, but there is a question about whether it's actually a lawful statute. And again, Maine doesn't have a lot of good case law to tell us whether that's the case or not. With the vehicle, there is a statute that addresses passing in a no passing zone. And I cite that in number 10 on page 6 of your materials. In general, I think the statute is pretty clear that you can pass in a no passing zone if it's safe to do so. There have been some law enforcement officers that have said that you can only do that in the case of an emergency because there's some ambiguity in the statutory language in that section. But I think that the statute actually, because it specifically talks about what you can do around bicyclists, and it appears to be intended, the history appears to be intended to allow for passing in a no passing zone, that it does allow for it so long as it's safe. So, you know, a lot of times drivers will commence a pass and it's like this, and it's not really safe to do it. So you have to actually make sure it's safe before you commence that pass. Here are just some of the different things that you would consider when trying to decide whether what was going on was legal. First, was that lane a lane of substandard width? Were these people riding at the normal speed of traffic? Was it unsafe to ride to the far right? Was someone overtaking or passing? Are they preparing for a turn? Are they avoiding hazards and the like? So. And we talked about this. So one of the exceptions to the riding to the far right that comes up a lot is that a bicyclist is allowed to ride anywhere in the lane if there's a lane of substandard width. And reasonable minds can differ on what that means. But the statute basically says a lane of substandard width means a lane that is too narrow for a bicycle or a roller skier in a vehicle to travel safely side by side in the lane. So many bicycle advocates and traffic engineers say that lanes need to be at least 14 feet to share. They say that a bicycle rider needs 4 feet to actually operate. You know, you're gonna have long handlebars in a number of different cases. You're gonna constantly be encountering, you know, cracking in the road, potholes, rough curbing, and the like. So generally, a lot of people say you've got to at least give 4 feet for the bicycle rider, and then you need another 3 feet for the law, where Maine law says you need to leave 3 feet when passing a bicyclist. And most motor vehicles, I shouldn't even say most because a lot are much bigger than 7 feet, but most small motor vehicles, passenger type vehicles, are 7 feet. So a lot of people say, you know, a bicyclist really can be most anywhere because most in Maine, because most lanes are of substandard width. And, you know, this is just one of the AASHTO guides that talks about what a bicyclist needs in the way of operational space. And this obviously in the courtroom and everywhere else when you're doing these cases is something that reasonable minds are going to differ on, and people are going to argue this number of different ways. So moving to some pedestrian photos, is this legal? These pedestrians are crossing outside of a crosswalk. So in general, not lawful. You're supposed to use cross in the marked crosswalks. Again, this is an interesting thing during the pandemic that we're going to see more of, because cities and towns are encouraging kind of slower streets and parklets and the like, which is encouraging people to cross at all sorts of locations. So even if it may not be lawful, the driver always has a duty not to hit a pedestrian. And so there's obviously always going to be a weighing of what was appropriate under the circumstances for everyone, pedestrians and drivers alike. So even though it may not be lawful, and this may be considered unlawful behavior for the pedestrian, if you get one of these cases, you're going to be looking at what should the driver have known as well, and was the driver on notice that this was a closed street or a street near like in a shopping district where people are going to be moving around and the like. Wearing dark clothing in nighttime. I know Rick's going to touch on this, so I'm going to just whip through this, but there is no statute that says you cannot wear dark clothing in the nighttime. Whether it's a prudent thing to do is another question, but we need to ask ourselves as a society whether we want, to replace our black wool coats that we wear to our offices with fluorescent pink ones, or whether we want to be able to walk across the street to a parking lot or to dinner without having to look like a piñata. So a lot of times in these cases, defense counsel is going to try to place the blame on your client if they didn't look like a Christmas tree. Certainly there are conspicuity issues that Rick's going to talk about, but there is no law saying that you have to dress a certain way. And, we don't do that for motor vehicles. We don't say your motor vehicle has to be hot pink so that pedestrians know you're coming, or that your motor vehicle has to have jingle bells associated with it. So why are we doing this for pedestrians, and who's driving that socio-cultural norm? And it's just something to think about as you have these cases. So do we encourage people to wear high-vis clothing? Yeah, there are a lot of entities in the state that are encouraging it, but we don't want people that are like leaving church to have to, look crazy in order to go to their parking lot. Here's an interesting situation. This is starting to happen as well. We got a couple of things going on in this photo. You've got the person that may be on their phone, and there's this new term that people are using to kind of try to demonize pedestrians. They're calling them pedestrians. And then you've got this bicyclist who is going. Now, it looks from this photo, the bicyclist has the right of way, and the pedestrian is stepping out. So with the pedestrian stepping out when the pedestrian mast says stop. So, this is a situation where the pedestrian definitely is in the wrong. Bicyclist does have a duty to yield to a pedestrian, but that duty obviously is subject to the standard of reasonableness. And if the bicyclist is not given enough time to perceive and react to the pedestrian, there's going to be a collision. And that's particularly so where the bicyclist in this case might not have any reason to anticipate that someone's going to violate the law. Here we've got a couple things going on. Bicyclist is operating outside the bike lane, and arguably under the 2063 statute, the bicyclist can do that because they might decide that that's the safest thing for them to do under that time and at that time and place. So just because there is a bike lane does not mean that a bicyclist has to be in it, regardless of whether there are scooters there. And even with some of the infrastructure that has been put up in our city here in Portland and other cities across the state, there are some bicyclists that still feel safer in the travel lane, and that is lawful. They are not required to use the bike lane. Scooters and skateboarders, right now, we have very little law, if any, law governing where they should be. And I've heard all sorts of things from responding officers. So some people believe, you know, scooters and skateboarders should be riding, that they're like pedestrians, they should be riding facing traffic. Others believe that they're like a bike. And the reality is we don't have a statute in the books right now. Is this legal? Hands-free phone notifications. So, you know, as everyone knows, we here in Maine passed law requiring that all phone usage be hands-free. That does not mean that you couldn't be cited for distracted driving if your phone is distracting you with beeps or buzzes or notifications and the like, and you end up in a crash. So the distracted driving statutes specifically allow for you to be found to be in violation of the law, even if you are hands-free. And I just say that as a matter of practice, I try not to use even hands-free electronic devices while operating a motor vehicle, because the reality is they really interfere with your perception, reaction time, and there's still a number of deaths that are caused by those devices, even if they're not in your hand. Is this legal, having speed limits enforced by photo or video footage? And the answer in Maine is that it is not legal to use photo enforcement at this point in time. And this is one of the things that's you know, under debate with people that are trying to eliminate the number of traffic deaths that we're seeing on our roadways. Other states like New York State and New York City are starting to use this, and they're finding that it is helping with the number of traffic deaths that they're seeing. So this is something that you may see on the horizon here in our state, is trying to eliminate the statute that prohibits photo enforcement. And then the final slide I have for you is whether e-bikes are lawful in our national park here in Maine. And as of right now, they are. They weren't for a while. But they are subject to a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit. So that's one of the things that's going on. And so there's lots of room for debate over whether e-bikes belong in natural places like parks. But one of the things that we're seeing is e-bikes, and we can talk about this later or offline, is e-bikes are getting more people on bikes, and the more people on bikes, the safer the roadways become for bicyclists. So that is the end of the first part of our presentation. And I'm going to quickly move us over to, I'm going to check the question and answers to make sure there's nothing. So there's a question for the end of the presentation. What approach do you take when your client, an injured plaintiff cyclist pedestrian, was crossing against a traffic signal, but was in a clearly marked crosswalk? So I think that really depends on whether your cyclist was acting as a motor vehicle or as a pedestrian. So a lot of times, and you have cases where someone may be crossing in a crosswalk as a cyclist, but they're going with the green light for motor vehicle traffic. And I would argue that's lawful. Whereas if a cyclist is off their bike and they're acting like a pedestrian and they're standing in front of a crosswalk and trying to cross when the signal doesn't allow for it, obviously that's against the law. And in all cases, motorists have a duty to be on the lookout for pedestrians and bicyclists. I often will turn down cases right and left, cases where people are violating the laws or where there's clear violation and it wasn't fair to the driver. But there are a lot of times when you look holistically at a situation and you can see that even if the traffic control device said one thing, that there still should have been awareness on the part of a driver to do something differently. So it's very contextual, and happy to talk about a specific situation offline. So keeping us on track, unless there are any other questions on this one, I will move us to the bike and pedestrian crash intake and investigation basics. So there are no slides or anything for this, and I'm going to give most of this over to Rick, but Steve Prince distributed a handout for you all, and that really walks you through some of the things to be looking for. One of the things that I want to stress from the beginning, actually there are two things. One is just like with asylum cases, people who have been involved in traffic trauma are truly, truly, truly traumatized. A lot of them have head injuries. A lot of them have injuries that don't even allow for them to get out of bed. They've, some of them have been degloved. A portion of their body has been ripped from their body. So these people have gone through some serious trauma. So when you are doing the intake, we often forget as attorneys, and we have these like checklists like the one I'm giving you, but it's super important to remember that you're dealing with a victim of trauma and to make sure that you're not re-victimizing them, and timing and sensitivity to their emotional state is super critical. And I always try to keep myself in check on that because I often want the facts, but yes, it takes time, it takes, and it's really hard to do during the pandemic because you're not able to sit with them closely and show them that, you care. So it's an art and something to keep in mind as you do these cases. The other key things to remember are that, you have to look at crashes from the handlebar perspective, from the perspective of the pedestrian, not just from a driver's perspective. So you really have to get out there and think about things from that lens and angle. And how you talk about crashes matters right from the beginning. A lot of people call these accidents, and these are not accidents. These are often preventable crashes or collisions, and you got to use the right semantics. So during client screening and interview process, I list everything that you want to start, not everything, but a lot of things that you want to look at. But one thing that's very common in these cases is that people don't recognize the extent of their injuries right away. I have, often police officers don't see the dents in helmets or the cracking in the helmets, and the bicyclists might not realize they had a head injury until later. A lot of these bicyclists are more concerned, depending on the person, with their bike at first than they are about the fact that they're, that they suffered a clavicle fracture or whatever it may be. So important thing is making sure that your clients are getting the care that they need, and that you are not just looking at hospital records and discharge records, but you're talking to them about what happened and looking at their helmets and really trying to understand the situation. And then you also, when you're doing your intake, want to make sure you know what kind of bicyclist you're dealing with, whether this is, where they were going, what type of experience they have with the bike they were riding, all types of things like that. Then when you get out, you always want to go out to the crash scene. There's no substitute whatsoever for visiting this crash scene many, many times, and ideally right away. You want to be looking at things like the width and nature of the way, whether it had any specific infrastructure on it that is relatively important to your case, what kind of paint is on the roadway, are we looking at a bike lane versus a shoulder, were there sharrows in the roadway or chevrons, which are those things that indicate bicyclists may use the full travel lane. With pedestrian cases, you see this all the time, you know, especially in the winter time. People might say, well, it's the pedestrians' fault. They were in the roadway. They shouldn't have been. But what did the sidewalks look like at that time? Were they full of snow? Were they usable? Where was the person trying to go? And was that the safest way they were could get to the place they needed to go? And looking at with bicycle cases, it's really important to look at conditions of the roadway. Were there sand piles, potholes, alligator cracking, hazards in the roadway, and the like? Was the area under construction? What else was going on? Always super important. The worst thing is when I get a bicycle case from someone else who had it for a couple of years, and they didn't get all the footage from the businesses and other cameras in the area. So always go, as soon as you get one of these cases, make sure that you have all of the footage, that you get it preserved, even if you can't get it turned over to you. Realize that people are keeping cameras on residences these days, so it's not out of the question to see whether there's footage from even a neighborhood house if something happens in a residential area. You also, if you're dealing with commercial trucks, a lot of them have cameras on them or other recording devices, so make sure that you preserve all of those, whether they're devices that record speed or images or whatever it may be, or stops. Also, these days, many bicyclists are carrying around electronic devices on their bikes that can be helpful to you. I'm not going to show it. I was going to, but what I can just do, because we're kind of tight on time, I'll just show you, like, here's an example of a rear light that actually has a camera on it. This is one I use often, and it's just like any other red light that you're going to see. So people might think it's just a light to, make sure drivers know you're there, but it's actually recording. And these are very, very helpful, particularly where the bicyclist is not at fault and is not able to give their story because they're either deceased or suffering from injury. So make sure you're looking for Garmin devices, GoPros, cycling cameras, any type of footage like that. And witnesses these days also take a lot of footage. And if you're dealing with a crash involving a number of riders, sometimes the bicyclist doesn't have all of those devices on, but one of their co-riders does. So make sure you capture all of that. Another thing you want to do when you go out to the scene is check, not just the immediate vicinity, but I check, a mile back, looking, for everyone in all directions, looking for what kind of signage was in the area, or were there signs there warning of pedestrians or 3-foot passing laws or speed limits. You also look for signage. Did the signage impact anyone's visibility? Was there any temporary signage up there? Was it, were you in a construction zone? Often, I've been involved in a number of crashes after the fact where through a freedom of access request, you can get background on what was going on the roadway at a particular time. If there was some type of surface condition that was caused by a construction project, that's something to look into, and you're going to want to assess whether temporary conditions impacted your crash in any way. Traffic control devices, you want to check how they work over and over and over and over again and get the records on how they work. So what was the timing? Was it automatic for a light system, or was it one that you had to actually trigger? So that's often the case with pedestrian cases. A lot of pedestrian masses in Maine are dysfunctional, so you want to know whether one was broken at the time of your crash or not, and whether there's a record of it not functioning. Lighting, you can find out wattage from CMP on the street lights and things like that. Always checking, time of day, moon cycle, glare, weather as it relates to lighting. Gathering public records. In many of these cases, it's crazy the number of bike and pedestrian cases where there is no crash report, because of a number of different factors. Often hit and runs might not get written up as a crash. Dog cases, you get an incident report, not a crash report. The dooring cases are ones where law enforcement officers might not write them up as a crash report. If there's an allegation of someone committing a crime, it might not get written up as a crash report. So you have to get information about these crashes other ways, whether it's through 911 call records and getting the court to order disclosure of names and more than just a redacted record, getting dispatch records, getting cruiser and chest camera footage and the like. Another big thing at the beginning of a case is property damage, getting the preservation letters out, asking to inspect vehicles as soon as possible, trying to set things up for spoliation arguments if people don't preserve evidence. You also want to make sure that you're, looking at your clients' bike and accessories and assessing those. A lot of my clients have bikes that are $8,000, $10,000. They're carbon bikes, and they may look like they're not damaged, but once they've been hit by a motor vehicle, they're compromised. So that's something that you need to be thinking about, getting the right experts to help your clients make sure that they get their property damage taken care of and properly so that they're not re-injured on a bike that's compromised. And again, because we're tight on time, I'll just say that Bicycle Blue Book and eBay, those are not, you'll get those from the insurance adjusters, and they'll try to, tell you that your clients' bikes are worth much less than they are because they're relying on these resources. But bikes are not like cars. You have no way of knowing whether they were involved in a crash before. So if someone's selling a bike on Bicycle Blue Book or eBay, you're not gonna know necessarily whether that bike has 7,000 miles on it or 14,000 miles on it, and whether it's been through 3 crashes or none. Whereas, if you want your client to get a safe bike, they're gonna have to have a replacement that they can trust. So that's an interesting area. When investigating, witnesses are often key. They're often not listed in the crash report. That is a perennial problem. Unfortunately, officers don't write everyone down. I've had luck with signs in the vicinity of a crash, posting them up in, it's basic, simple stuff that pre-social media, where you just put a sign up in the local convenience store, and you'd be surprised at how you find witnesses. But social media works as well. 911 records, if you get the court to disclose names, you can get witness names there. Often witnesses will call a spouse or a family member for a bicyclist, and your client will have someone's phone number on their phone and they hadn't even thought to tell you about it. So, you want to make sure that you ask your client, did someone help get your wife here to the scene, or whatever it may be, because that's a great way to find witnesses. And obviously the types of things you're going to ask witnesses about, they're listed under number 9. It's going to be everything from statements that they heard at the scene of a crash to the behavior of the persons involved, time distance questions like, when did the bicyclist start putting their left hand out to say that they were going to make a left-hand turn? Which pole was it? And those types of things can make a difference for your client. If someone close in time can say, here's where the bicyclist started signaling, and here's where the car nailed them from behind. So obviously, all of that is important. And then the other big thing, before I turn this over to Rick, is looking at all the potential insurance coverage. It can be anything from automobile insurance to commercial insurance to homeowners, renters. There are a number of bicyclists that carry bicycle insurance. If people are membership in certain organizations, sometimes there's additional coverage through those organizations. Workplaces sometimes have additional personal injury coverage. If someone's riding in an event, there might be event insurance, although you might have waiver and liability issues there. And if it's a rideshare program, there may be some potential coverage through the rideshare program, although there are often disclaimers and releases in the user agreements. So, you know, coverage, you're always going to want to look at ownership of the vehicle that hit your bicyclist or pedestrian. Sometimes you can find an extra policy if the vehicle is co-owned. And looking at MedPay, PIP, even though we're not a PIP state, sometimes people are out, you know, from outside and PIP provisions apply, property damage, UIM, and also be looking at exclusion issues and looking at all of your own clients' benefits. So that is the end of my intake investigation basics, and I'm going to turn it over now to Rick, who we're really fortunate to have. He's one of the leading experts in the state that does this type of work.
Good morning, folks. Thanks for inviting me to do this. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I will say that the handouts that Lori is providing are very, very good. Her checklist is very thorough, and it actually touches on a lot of what I was going to talk about this morning, which is good because it'll save me a little bit of time. So I'm going to share my screen and start my PowerPoint presentation here. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see that okay. But as Lori pointed out, in collision investigation, each one of these is unique and will present special circumstances. And what I have found, and Lori and I have worked both on the same side and opposing sides, and we as a company, the Crash Lab, our job is to evaluate the available evidence and provide our client with a good opinion as to where they stand in the case. And as Lori knows, we've had occasions where I have not been able to help her, and I've had occasions where I have been able to help her. And again, we've also worked on opposite sides, but all of these cases should be investigated thoroughly with all of the given fact patterns. And each one of those are always different. And what I have found, excuse me, is that very, very seldom do we have a clear-cut case for either the plaintiff or the defendant. Very often there are, could potentially be contributing circumstances on both parties or mitigating circumstances for either party. But very, very seldom do we ever have a case where it's just 100% clear-cut on one party or the other. What type of facts are we looking for? For us, you know, in a nighttime collision, we're looking at low light conditions. We're looking at weather, rain and fog. Is the roadway wet? You know, what type of impact was there to a bike or pedestrian? You know, we're looking at final rest of the riders or pedestrians, final rest of the vehicle. Was it controlled or not controlled? Final rest. And unfortunately, and listen, I come from a law enforcement background, so that's where my heart is from, but I do get frustrated at times with the lack of investigation that we get sometimes. And I don't think I think it's more of a lack of understanding of the type of investigation that officers are looking at because they're not trained as reconstructionists. There are times that we do get reconstructionists involved, but even so, there is so many specialties within the reconstruction field itself. You have to continue your training. I've been doing this for over 30 years and I still learn something on every case. And we have to maintain our continuing education. And, you know, and some of these folks out there, they're very good at what they do, but sometimes it may be a lack of no specialized training in a particular field. But you know, I've had cases where if an officer on scene would have taken one photograph, it would have prevented a trial, or at least maybe even a suit. But unfortunately, sometimes we don't get that. You know, some of the other things we're looking at are where was the pedestrian and bicycle located? Was there a crosswalk involved? Were they walking with or against traffic? Were there traffic control signals available? Were they working? How visible were they prior to the area of the incident? And as Lori pointed out, what were the road conditions? Is there a reason why a bicyclist or a pedestrian was not walking, or riding to the right or in a location that they should have been? Because we've had cases where, unfortunately, in one instance, we had a bicyclist who was a racer and was practicing, and he's in the paved shoulder of the roadway, and unbeknownst to him, at some point, the pavement stops and we get soft sand, and he has to make a decision. Do I drive into the soft sand at speed, or do I try to get back onto the roadway? And unfortunately, there was a lip at the roadway and caused him to lose control of his bike. But those are all situations that we have to look at and why it contributed or how it contributed to the incident. We look at clothing and reflective gear and lighting, and this could be for the pedestrian, for the bicyclist, for the car. Are the lights working? Was it low beam? Was it high beam? What other conditions contributed? In other words, clothing in and of itself, I know that Lori talked about wearing a specific kind of clothing. Well, that's very difficult because, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but when you're talking about contrast and conspicuity, just because you're wearing a bright orange shirt doesn't necessarily make you that much more visible. It depends upon what your background is. What is your background to make you either stick out or blend in, one or the other? So we're looking at contrast and conspicuity. Were there distractions on behalf of the driver, bicyclists, or pedestrians? And I'm not, Lori pointed out that even though you may have a hands-free, there could still be distraction. And I agree with that. The problem is that's very difficult to prove unless the person is admitting that they were distracted by something like that. So yes, we can look at cell phone records and we can determine was the cell phone or a device in use at the time, but it's still pretty difficult to show whether a person was distracted or not. You can certainly make that implication, but it is difficult without concrete evidence. And I'm going to kind of skip over these because Lori has a great handout with statutes, and I just picked some. Riding to the right when it's appropriate. These are for the bicycles that they're subject to the motor vehicle rules of the road. They do have a duty to yield to pedestrians and a crosswalk. I actually did investigate a bicycle pedestrian collision that occurred in a crosswalk. And one of the statutes that applied in that particular case was cars that were in the lane of travel were stopped at the marked crosswalk to allow the pedestrians to pass, and the bicyclist was passing on the right in that case. So in that case, I think the pedestrian was more in the right than the bicyclist was, because they're not supposed to overtake a vehicle if they're stopped, if a vehicle is stopped waiting for pedestrians to cross a crosswalk. Section 2084 talks about lighting and that it needs to be visible for 200 feet to the, or a headlight visible for 200 feet with rear deflectors and reflectors. And we always look for that. But one of the things that we try to take a step further was how recognizable the patterns are. And I'll show some screenshots of some typical patterns and how it may be difficult to see or not see, but I do very much agree with Lori in that when a pedestrian or bicyclist is moving, it's a little bit easier to be able to determine that you're at least seeing something ahead of you. You still have to recognize what you're seeing in order to identify it and locate it. Again, pedestrian, you should be walking against traffic unless there's a sidewalk present. Pedestrians must yield the right of way except in a marked crosswalk. Pedestrians may not cross, and this is all in statute, so you're not supposed to cross mid-block except within a crosswalk. You're not supposed to cross at an angle at an intersection unless you're authorized by a traffic control device. And even though you may, and this is where we run into issues now and then, because I'll tell an interesting story. I was actually in a pedestrian training class at one point, and there was a university in another state that was having a lot of car pedestrian crashes, and they had a crosswalk, and it was at a crosswalk. And how they solved the problem was to eliminate the crosswalk, because what was happening was pedestrians in their mind were thinking, hey, I've got a crosswalk and vehicles have to yield the right of way to me. And they were just walking into the crosswalk without always giving a vehicle operator the time to perceive and avoid. So when they eliminated the crosswalk, it forced the pedestrians to pay more attention to where they were crossing also. And that helped reduce the number of car pedestrian cases. So, you know, and again, that's one of the things that we always look at. Even though it happened at a crosswalk, was everybody involved given an opportunity to avoid the crash? We look at pedestrian activated signals, and we look at traffic control timing. And I know that Lori touched on that too. Very often we'll go out to a scene of a crash if it happens at an intersection, and we'll set up video cameras. And if it requires multiple video cameras, we do that so that we can really pin down the timing of the traffic lights and pedestrian control signals. Because as you know, some of them are activated only if there is a vehicle or a pedestrian available. And it may affect the timing of the sequence depending upon vehicles waiting in a queue. So we do that very often. It's always good to get the engineering plan if that's possible. They can be very difficult to read. I personally find it's easier to go out and videotape with synchronized cameras so that we can really understand how the light timing system works. But that's one of the things that we like to do. We're talking about low light conditions. It's not as simple as just being dark or light. And we typically will use some official websites that determine what the lighting is. If it's daytime, it's daytime. And even then, we have to look at contrast and conspicuity depending upon a person's background, or the background where say a pedestrian or bicycle is operating. So one of the things that we look at when we're trying to determine what a person can see is what type of light is there? What time of night is it? So civil twilight is basically from sunset to where the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon. And at the end of that civil twilight is when a person has to rely on additional lighting to help illuminate an object if there is no other lighting out there. So that's where, you know, right at sunset, or right at the beginning of sunset, there still is a fair amount of light, and we kind of call it dusk. But as you get to the end of civil twilight, there is more of a need to have supplemental lighting to be able to illuminate an object or to recognize that an object is there. And nautical twilight is when the sun is 6 to 12 degrees below the horizon, and astronomical twilight is when the sun is 12 to 18 degrees below the horizon, and it's very, very easy to see stars on a clear night. So it's important for us. It's always nice to be able to have the exact conditions. When we go to look at a scene, we want the exact conditions, if at all possible. So very often, I'll get asked to go out on an anniversary of a crash, but that's not necessarily the best time to go, because we want to look at the lighting conditions, the moon conditions. Was there cloud cover? Was there not cloud cover? So it's not necessarily to be there on an anniversary of a collision. It's necessary to be there when the lighting conditions are most similar to the time of the crash. And we'll use the United States Naval Oceanography portal, and we'll get information, you know, such as this, which will give us the beginning of civil twilight, both in the morning and in the evening, the end of civil twilight, It tells us what time the moon rises. It tells us what phase the moon is in, and that's very important. In this particular example, we have a waning crescent with 10% of the moon's visible disk illuminated. So what that means is it's in a crescent phase of the moon and it's getting smaller. So the waning crescent means it's getting smaller. The waxing of a crescent moon means it's starting to get bigger. So there are several different phases. So if a crash happened during a full moon, we don't want to go out if it's the anniversary of a crash, and the waning crescent of 10% would not be as applicable as finding a night when the moon was full. So we try to pay attention to that very much. We also look at the weather. Rain and fog obviously have an effect on what you can see and how fast you can recognize an object. There are several different websites out there. I use Weather Underground most often. And we can get information such as this, which is at the time of day or in time intervals, what our temperature is the wind, is there any sort of wind, is there any sort of fog, or in this case, we can see overcast, fog in different time periods will let us know what we're getting if there's any rain or not rain, or sunshine, cloudiness, what have you. When it comes to bicycle, and listen, this is kind of holds for both bicycle and pedestrian. We're just trying to collect as much evidence as we can, but the make and model of the bicycle, the tire size and the conditions, the vertical and horizontal measurements, the seat height, these are all important pieces of information for us. The number of gears on the front and rear, number of sprockets on each gear, and if we know what gear the bicycle is in, there is a potential that we can calculate the speed if we know the cadence. I'll show you a software, an Excel spreadsheet that we use to help us do that. But again, bicycle conspicuity. Are there reflectors? Are there lighting? Where are they located on the bike? How many are there? Active lighting. Lori demonstrated a rear active light / camera that works really, really nice. What's the condition of the bike? Are the brakes all functional? The handlebar positions help us to determine what position the rider may have been in and how it may have affected any reflectiveness that they may have on their clothing or what have you. This is a real crash. You can see that in this particular bike, we've got one reflector on the rear. I do believe this was a daytime crash though. So it was a pretty significant impact to the rear of the bike, and it was a relatively low fronted vehicle because of where the impact is located on the bicycle. But this is an example of, a bike that was involved in a crash, and we're trying to document all the evidence that we can on that particular vehicle. Rider information, what we're looking for is how far from the impact was final rest, and that helps us with potential speed estimates or throw distances. And we need to confirm that the rider wasn't moved. What happens very often, and it's very frustrating at times, is you get a car pedestrian or a car bicycle type crash, and we get good Samaritans that come out that happen to either be there very quickly, maybe even have witnessed the crash or what have you, but they like to help clean the roadway up and move pieces of evidence out of the roadway. And it makes it more difficult for us. We like to see all the pieces of evidence in their final rest location undisturbed, because that helps us determine directions of forces. It helps us to determine directions of pre-impact directions of both vehicles, bicyclists, pedestrians. We also look at, the clothing. Again, we talked about this, but reflective material, active lighting, and if it's not reflective clothing, what color is it and how does it compare with the contrast of a background in conspicuity? We like to know the rider height and what type of injuries, because it helps us determine the manner of impact between the two vehicles. was it a 90-degree collision? Was it a 180-degree collision? Or in other words, a rear end collision or a frontal collision? Or was it a side impact? And again, here's an incident where police painted the scene quite well. And obviously they photographed a fair amount of evidence, and it was all very helpful for us in looking at where the evidence is and what direction it was projected after the impact to give us an idea of direction of forces and the extent of the forces. With vehicles, again, we like to know if the final rest positions are dynamic or controlled. And for us, we like to know that it was an uncontrolled stop, that, it's very much easier for us to determine a potential speed if we know that the vehicle came to an uncontrolled stop. Or in other words, a crash happens and an operator applies the brakes and he holds the brakes until they stopped and then he doesn't move. We have to know whether it's controlled. If it's a controlled stop, we have to look at other avenues to try to attempt to calculate speed based upon the evidence. And again, same with the bicyclist and pedestrian. If it's moved, who moved it? How far did they move it? Does anybody have an idea where the original position was? Document all the damage. We always use scales when we document the damage so that we can corroborate height of vehicle damage to height of pedestrian and or bicycle damage. The headlights of the vehicles, were they working? We do have techniques to be able to tell if a headlight was on or not. Unfortunately, it will only tell us if a headlight was on. So in other words, if we see what we call hot shot, and that is a filament in a light bulb that may have been stretched or may have been oxidized to indicate that a vehicle was on when an impact happened. The problem is if you don't see it, you can only say you don't see it. It doesn't necessarily mean they weren't on at an impact, especially with the newer halogen headlights where the filaments are very much thicker and a whole lot stronger. You have to get impacts that happen very, very close to the headlight or the filament in order to get any sort of hot shot. So typically, you can only say when the lights are on at an impact. It's very difficult to say that the lights were not on at an impact. I have reconstructed crashes where I had 4 skid marks indicating 4 wheels were locked and sliding, and a car goes into a tree, and there was absolutely no evidence in the rear brake lights that they were on. The brake lights were too far away from the front of the vehicle where the impact occurred. So in this case, we relied on other physical evidence, but so yes, we can look at headlight filaments to be able to assist us to determine if their headlights are on and working properly. We just don't always know if they were actually on because we don't see the evidence. In other words, what I was trying to say was they're likely on, we just don't see the evidence that they were on at the time of the impact. And here is, we're looking at vehicle evidence, bumper heights, leading edge of vehicle heights. It helps to determine for us what type of pedestrian or bicycle reconstruction technique we may use. So in other words, if you get, let's say, a pedestrian that is 6 feet tall and the top of the vehicle is below his center of mass, he's likely going to wrap onto the hood. And we have to take that into consideration because it's a different type of reconstruction technique. And when a pedestrian or bicyclist wrap onto a hood, they're likely not going to get all of the vehicle speed. They're only going to get a percentage. And there are lots of arguments out there about how much of a percentage. Some say they may only get 80% of the vehicle speed, but that's very, very subjective. So we like to stay with this is the speed based upon the pedestrian throw. The vehicle speed is likely slightly higher. How much is subjective. Or if you get a very high front vehicle with a low center of mass and the pedestrian or the bicyclist is projected forward, we call that a forward projection. It's likely that the pedestrian or the bicyclist is going to absorb much more or nearly all of the vehicle's speed at impact. And those are all things that we look at. Roadway, again, tire marks, were there any pre and post impact skids, were there scuffed, were there deflections? And yes, we have been able to see deflections in skid marks upon an impact with the pedestrian, even though the pedestrian may not be real heavy, but we still, if you look very close, you can see that. Bicycle tire marks, are there any scuffing at impacts? Very often there is scuffing by the tires on an impact with a vehicle. And we use our scales to corroborate locations of impacts between the bicycles and the vehicles. Pedestrian clothing transfer. We may not know, it's sometimes very difficult to find where a pedestrian, if he gets projected, or bicyclist gets projected into the air where he comes to, where he hits the roadway again. Pedestrian clothing transfer is very helpful with that. And it also gives us a direction of travel, gives us a direction of the force. Pedestrian shoe scuffs, although I have seen them to indicate area of impact, it is very, very difficult to see. And I think in all the years that I've been doing this, maybe once or twice have I ever seen a pedestrian scuff. You actually see it a lot easier on the pedestrian's shoes itself. You can see scuff marks on the bottom of their feet or the bottom of the shoes. But for the actual transfer to happen in the roadway, that doesn't happen very often. We look at lane markings, lane widths, shoulder widths. All of this goes into our observations of what happened in a particular incident and what contributing circumstances occur in each situation. We look at potholes, cracks, bike lanes. Again, we talked about this before, traffic control devices, street lighting. And I know Lori mentioned that we can get wattage from street lights, but it's more important for us to take a light meter out and determine what sort of illumination that we get at a scene. And we may have two very bright street lights on a roadway, but if the pedestrian or the bicyclist is right in between the two street lights, we have to take that into consideration because that makes them more difficult to see. I was actually, I didn't put any photographs on this because it's a relatively active case, but we were taking some nighttime visibility photographs with a person in very dark clothing. And we found, and I had never seen this before, but we found that the further away the vehicle was, it was actually easier to see the outline of the pedestrian because of the angle the pedestrian was situated based upon the background. The closer that you got to the pedestrian, the more that angle changed and the background became dark and it became more difficult to see. So the question in that particular case may be, is it reasonable to suspect or reasonable to say that a driver at, let's say, 300 feet away, even though we know what we're looking at, because hindsight is 20/20 and we're doing the testing, we know where the pedestrian is, and we can see the outline, is it reasonable to expect the driver to recognize that there's a pedestrian there? Obviously, in that particular case, the closer we got, I would say no, but the further away that we were, and it's a dynamic situation, so it's sometimes difficult to tell. So we do look at street lighting, we look at friction factors, and in this case, we either rely on studies from throughout the country on what the average friction factors are, or if you've got the actual vehicle involved, you can skid test it, but that doesn't happen very often anymore because you're kind of ruining tires when you do that. Our other traffic involved, if you can show that you're in a low lit area and you have a pedestrian or bicyclist, let's say for instance it's a rainy day and you have a pedestrian or bicyclist in a roadway and you've got oncoming traffic, the disability glare is really substantial. And it really makes it difficult to see other objects in the roadway. Sometimes it's very difficult for us to know whether or not there is another vehicle involved, and that's when and I'll get into this in a minute, but we rely upon security video or traffic videos or what have you to be able to determine what other traffic may or may not be in the roadway at the time, and how does it affect a driver's ability to recognize an object in the roadway. Speed estimates and car, pedestrian, car, bikes, it's, we're typically using minimum speed calculations or pedestrian bicycle throw formulas. We also have the ability to calculate speed from RPM on a bicyclist if we know the particulars about the bike's gears and sprockets. And here's an Excel spreadsheet where we can enter the number of teeth on a ring, whether it be the front sprocket or the rear sprocket, and then based upon the wheel diameter, we can calculate basic speeds or approximate speeds, and with cadences. So we have to know, this is what Laurie touched on this, what's the experience level of a bike rider? And there are some studies out there, it's hard to find, where recreational bike riders tend to ride at a lower cadence than, let's say, someone that rides all the time, or they are cross-country riders or potentially race riders. Their cadences tend to be a little bit higher. And obviously, Laurie, if you differ with me, please jump in and say, because you ride all the time. But that's what we do find. Somebody that's a recreational rider that rides occasionally doesn't tend to operate at a cadence as high as someone that rides, and I don't want to say professionally, but there definitely would be a difference.
It's all contextual is my response. It completely
Yes.
depends, on the circumstance, but
Yes, it does.
It doesn't matter. I think you're right.
But that's a way that we can approximate a bicycle speed. And obviously we have to make sure that it makes sense in the situation that we have. Laurie touched on the security videos, and I apologize. I had several security videos of actual bike pedestrian crashes, but for some reason, Windows decided to update this weekend, and now I can't add a video to my PowerPoint. But one of the things I want to caution on video is, number one, you need to know what the perspective of the camera is and how it relates to what you're seeing in the video. And the reason I say that is in this next slide, this is a general mapping of a case that we worked where we were calculating speed of a motorcycle. Up in this area right here, if you can see my mouse, is where the video camera was. And we could see this portion of the roadway with some landmarks. Well, you can see here, it makes a difference as to where the motorcycle would have been positioned. If he's positioned in this lane, well, the distance that we're seeing in the video may be a little shorter. If he's positioned in this lane here, the distance is going to be a little bit longer. And you can't just go out and measure the roadway in a two-dimensional sort of way. You have to have the perspective of the camera, because it does potentially make a difference in the distance that you're measuring, which will affect your time distance calculation. The other important thing I would like to bring up is that if at all possible, we want the original proprietary video from the camera itself so that we can get the metadata. Because as you know, or maybe you do, maybe you don't, but a lot of video has what we call actual frames, where it's actually capturing the time and the image that the camera is looking at. But then there are also predictive frames. In predictive frames, it's predicting where the pixels are going to be, maybe for 1 to 2 to 3 frames. You're not really sure. So it's very important for us to know what the frame rate is. And in some videos, it varies. So you can't just make an assumption that it's a 30 frame per second video. And when you upload, let's say an MP4 to any particular video program, it may generically tell you that it's a 30 frame per second video, But if you really break down the frames, you may find that it varies. And you really need to know that because it could affect the timing of your video and the time that it takes a vehicle to get from one location to another. So it's not quite as simple always that it seems. There are some really nice video analysis software out there. We don't particularly have them yet, but we have access to them. And it is helpful in determining the time of each individual frame. In general, you can, you may get frames, you may get videos that are 10 frames per second, 15 frames per second, 25, 30, 60, depending upon the camera and the system. If you go out and purchase a relatively high quality video camera, you're going to get 60 frames per second. If you look at a lot of security videos, a lot of times a company or an establishment is they want their security video, but they don't want to spend a lot of money. So they may not have a very high resolution of frame rate in their cameras. And it is difficult. It is more difficult when you have a camera that's only 10 frames per second. It's not as accurate as something that is at least, say, 25 or 30 frames per second. But it is important to know what your frame rate is. And, I've been provided cell phone videos of a video playing on a computer, and it's really not very helpful when you get that. But if it's all you've got, at least it gives you an idea of what happened at the collision. Electronic data with motor vehicles. Nearly all of the motor vehicles that we deal with nowadays collect some sort of crash data. Whether or not it's always commercially available to us is still, we're getting more and more vehicles. There are fewer and fewer vehicles out there that we don't have the ability to collect data from. And with passenger cars, if an airbag deploys, that data is there and it's not going anywhere, okay? If there is what we call a non-deployment, then there is a potential to lose the data, so we want to get at those vehicles as soon as possible. So when a motor vehicle is involved in a collision, most of the newer vehicles nowadays require up to a 5 mile per hour change in speed over 50 to 100, 150 milliseconds in order to record the data. And the airbag control modules on a vehicle, they're there solely to protect the occupant. And the newer the vehicles are, the smarter these systems are. So it is constantly analyzing change in speed over time for the potential to deploy the airbag. And it really does know if the collision is severe enough when to deploy the airbag. So you may get a real severe collision and the airbag deploys almost instantaneous from the onset of the collision. You may get some crashes where the airbag may not deploy even though there is substantial damage. And in cases like that, what we look at is how elongated was the event, because the airbag or the system knows when the operator is going to be too close to the steering wheel to actually deploy. So if you're slowing down, but you're not slowing down at a rate that is severe enough to deploy the airbag knows that if the occupant is too close to the steering wheel, it may not deploy. So it doesn't necessarily mean there is a defect in the airbag, but we just have to look at all the data. So, and along with that, we really don't just look at an airbag control module download and determine what happened in the crash. You have to have the physical evidence and a situationally complete reconstruction to be able to interpret what is going on in an airbag control module download, because on occasion, they're very, very accurate. All the testing has shown that they're very accurate, but you may get an anomaly now and then, and you have to be able to explain what the anomaly is. And even though you may see an anomaly in part of the data, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of it is inaccurate. But we can get information such as accelerator pedal position. throttle position, which is different. The throttle is at the throttle body. The accelerator pedal position is how much the pedal is being depressed. We can get steering input, which at times is extremely helpful for us. Typically though, we'll get brake activation, but that only means that there was enough pressure on the brake switch to close the loop and activate the third brake light or the brake lights. That doesn't mean there was any braking involved. You have to actually look at the data to determine how much of that, how much braking was involved. Vehicles also have, maybe equipped with GPS units. And I'll show some screenshots of this, but Garmin has the ability, if you're involved in a wreck and you have a route programmed into your Garmin GPS, and we have Garmin Basecamp where we can actually look at the route and it will give us GPS location and speed along the route. Here's an example of a very simple and older EDR, event data recorder report, where we're getting 2.5 seconds of speed. And in this case, you can see that the brake switch at the bottom is on until the last second, but the speed isn't really slowing down a whole lot. So what that tells me is he's not really, his foot is likely on the pedal, but he's not really slowing down at any great rate of speed. This is a different make or model where we got 5 seconds of data in 1/10 of a second resolution, which is very helpful. We get accelerated pedal position and we get engine throttle position. And again, our brake switch on or off. And in this case, it was off the whole time. Here's one that has steering data. And we're not necessarily looking at steering input in degrees. And in this case, negative means to the right, positive, negative means to the left. And no, negative is to the right, positive is to the left. Sorry about that. We're more concerned with the yaw rate. And that is how many degrees per second a vehicle is turning. And we can calculate that calculate the amount of degree of change based on the time sample and the yaw rate. So if you have a good starting position, in this case, I can look at this and say, hey, the 0 yaw rate 5 seconds before this event occurred right here, and then it starts to change. I can actually calculate what degree the vehicle will be heading, or what the heading is, in this case, 3.6 seconds. There was more data here, but I cut it off. I can clearly look, and then we can plot that on a map if you want. And I have used that in the past to determine an impact location, because we weren't sure exactly where an impact happened, but we had a good starting position and we had good yaw rate data. And I also had speed data, and extrapolating that data over time, we could actually keep plotting the direction or the heading of the vehicle at each speed sample to determine approximately where the impact occurred. And it was very helpful. We can also get heavy truck data in case you get a collision involving a heavy truck. This is a little bit more difficult because the data is much more vulnerable to be lost or overwritten. We use a company that performs forensic imaging of the data. A lot of folks will take their truck to a dealership and have them download the vehicle. The problem with that is a dealership is they're looking at the data from an engine performance or driver point of view. What is the driver doing? And it's very, very easy to overwrite or eliminate data that an electronic control module in a truck has available to us. It's also very important to document the real time versus the time that's reported on the electronic control module, because the federal government allows it to drift so much time per year, and you need to be able to match the times on the ECM to the immediate crash. And if there are any time discrepancies, you can account for that. Typically, they'll have 45 seconds of pre-crash data and 15 seconds of post-crash data. I've been working very hard with local police departments, and here in Maine, we have pretty good luck because in most trucks, there are two types of data. There are hard brake events and there are last stop events. A last stop event is if you stop your truck, you're going to get 45 seconds of that pre-crash data and 15 seconds of post-crash data, or post-stop data, put it that way. But the minute that you move that truck with power applied to it, you're going to lose that last stop record. And sometimes that's the only data that you get, because in order to trigger a hard brake event, most trucks need a 7 to 9 mile per hour per second change in speed in order to do that. And even if you tend to get that hard brake event, if a police department allows the truck to move, there's nothing saying that you may not get more hard brake events on the way back to the shop or wherever you go, if it's still in running condition. So what I've done is I've tried to educate the police. There is a speed sensor on the output shaft of a transmission. And at least with the Maine State Police, they're very often now will climb underneath the truck and at least unplug that vehicle speed sensor so it does not sense that the vehicle is moving again and overwrite that last stop data. You know, I've had such occasions where the tow company was fairly close to the crash, so they thought they would make it easy, and they just left the truck running and towed it to the scene so they didn't have to air up the brake system to allow the truck to move. Well, when that happens and they move the truck, the last stop data is gone. It's absolutely gone. So I could spend a whole day on just electronic data from a truck, but it's a lot easier to overwrite and lose data with a truck than it is a motor vehicle and an airbag control module. Here's a very simple example of one page of a truck, and we'll typically get incident date and incident time that helps us, and incident odometer readings, which helps us pinpoint that a hard brake event may or may not apply to the instant collision that we're having. And so it's very important for us to record this sort of information when we're examining the vehicles. Whoops, I'm sorry. Depending upon the system that a company uses, and most companies nowadays are required to have electronic control logs or electronic log data, and a lot of them have GPS available. Unfortunately, the resolution isn't always as high as they could be. ECM data is great. GPS data is good if it's in high enough resolution and that it's accurate. In this case, this was a graph that the software actually provided for us, which is very helpful to look at a vehicle and when it brakes and when it doesn't brake, and when in this collision sequence that the actual impact occurred. And then it could be in tabular form also, which is very helpful. But again, some of the electronic log data, GPS data, or telematic system is a general term for this. Some are way better than others. Okay, and Lori touched on this, bicycle GPS data, Garmin, Strava, Boomerang, Beeline, Smart Halo, and I noticed Lori mentioned Apple Watches. Very often we'll have data. So as an example of, and it can collect speed, bike cadence, wheel speed, elevation change, location. Be careful about the location based upon GPS because it's solely dependent upon the number of satellites that are pinging at any given time. I've had some that are pretty darn accurate, and I've had some where it's showing that a bicycle is operating about 20 feet off the paved surface of the roadway, and you know that's not realistic. So you just have to be careful and keep that in mind when you're looking at the speed that it's reporting also, because it's reporting the average speed in between 2 points. But actually, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to bring up an example of a Garmin GPS data, which is really cool. So give me 1 second.
And while you do that, Rick, I'm just going to let everyone know that we're at 11:52. I know a lot of you are anxious to hear Bob O'Brien's presentation about e-bikes and the like. So, you know, I'm not sure how much more you have, Rick, but we can run over and Steve will alter CLE credit, but we also want to be sensitive to those of you who are planning on exiting at noon. So I would say, Rick, maybe to the extent that this we can do after Bob, we can, you know, we might be able to toggle back and forth, but I would do a little bit more and then
Okay.
we'll trim.
Okay, really quickly, here is an example of some data that we have. And if I scroll down here, we get elevation change, speed, heart rate, bike cadence, temperature. And as I move my mouse along, you can see that it actually gives me a pinpoint of where the bicyclist was at any given time, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to be really quick here. I'm going to go back to my original presentation, and then I just want to skip to, okay. That was, okay. This is a Garmin Basecamp report, which gives us elevation, leg distance, leg time, leg speed, GPS data. And again, I'm going to go through this stuff pretty fast. This is a map of a Garmin Basecamp where, again, it will tell us where a vehicle was at any given time and the speed. I actually had done some charts on time distance, basically on a bicycle collision. It was a vehicle rear-ended a bicycle. And the GPS gave it to us in 6-second intervals, which makes it a little more difficult. So we have 0, here is impact. We're looking at the distance a bike traveled in the reported interval. And I can compare that with a car. This was a 50-mile-an-hour zone. In my next slide, and what I ended up doing was extrapolating and just making an assumption that the speed was the same between the intervals. And you know, I have to say that may or may not be the case, but it made it a little bit easier for me to show how far away the bicycle versus the vehicle was 1 second before the impact, 2 seconds before the impact, and so on and so forth. And this is an example of one of the studies that we did. This was a daytime crash. This was the clothing that the bicyclist was wearing. This was 10 seconds from impact. Now we can look at that. It's very easy for us. And like I say, hindsight is 20/20. There is some dark background. So there's pretty good contrast. In this case, I can see the bicyclist, but I know he's there. 10 seconds away, is it reasonable to expect a driver to see this? Maybe. 9 seconds, 8 seconds, 7 seconds. At this point, I'm thinking, you got 7 seconds, you should be able to see the bicyclist. Okay, and it's just we continue to go to work closer to try to illustrate what the driver should have been able to see. This is something that I think is important. It's a human factors acronym called CAPLETS. Contrast. What's important about this, if you don't have sufficient data for any one of these sections, you likely are not going to recognize there's an object in front of you. So contrast, how much do you stand out from the background? Anticipation, and when I talk about anticipation, experience may play into this. I know that Lori mentioned something about peds walking mid-block. Now, as a driver, what would our expectation be of a pedestrian walking mid-block? Well, I guess it depends upon how does the driver live in that area? Do they know that pedestrians have a tendency to cross mid-block? Or whenever they see a pedestrian, are they on mark? Are they in a marked crosswalk, or are they on a sidewalk? It all depends. So anticipation very much plays into our perception response. Pattern. Pattern is very important. Edges. We need to be able to see edges, and we need to be able to identify them. Camouflage works because you can't see the edges, and it makes it difficult to recognize that an object is there. Light, obviously, the darker an object is, the more light we need to see it. Eccentricity. Basically, drivers respond faster to objects that are straight ahead of them than when they're at an angle. And also, Lori touched on this once before. I heard her say, I could be approaching an intersection, and there could be a lot of visibility of another vehicle approaching the side intersecting roadway that has a traffic control device, maybe a stop sign. People inherently expect other people to obey the traffic laws. They're not expecting that someone is going to not stop at the stop sign. And the more eccentricity you have, the longer perception response time that usually occurs. Time of exposure, you know, the more time you have to recognize something, the better it is. Size, if a pattern exists, generally the larger object has more probability of detection. So again, if you don't have sufficient amount of any of the above categories, detection is unlikely. This is from some human factors standpoint. This is a dark, unlit road. Typical pedestrian detection with dark clothing on the left side is about 85 feet. The right side is about 125 feet. And as your clothing gets lighter, the detection distance increases. This is assuming that it's a recognizable shape and that there is no lighting in the roadway. It has to be a recognizable shape or you're not going to detect what it is, or you're not going to recognize what it is. This was some actual testing that we did. It was a car pedestrian crash. The pedestrian was walking with traffic in the travel lane. We weren't sure if there was a black hood. Actually, the pedestrian was wearing two sweatshirts, and we didn't know if it was a black hood or a white hood, so we tested both. This is 1 second, 58 feet in a 40-mile-an-hour zone with the white hood, and it's a low beam, so this is 1 second away. Okay, this is 1 second with the dark hood. You actually lose a little bit of your outline when you put the dark hood up. You can only see from basically the waist up. This is 2 seconds with low beam, 116 feet away with the black hood. This is 2 seconds with the white hood. You can't even really see the white hood now. This is 3 seconds. Gone. Can't see it. 3 seconds away, okay? An example of patterns. This is a pretty recognizable pattern. This is very helpful. This is very helpful in detecting it. This is a pattern that's not very helpful, okay? And this is what we have to look at when we're looking at car, bicycle, car, pedestrian type crashes. Reflective vests, you know, sometimes it's really difficult. Would you be able to recognize what you're looking at if you have no other context other than these reflective vests that they're showing right there? And these are some examples of different reflective vest patterns. And obviously pattern E should be easier to detect than obviously pattern A. But if you've got one square of reflectivity, are you going to be able to recognize that as an object or know what it is, or to be able to detect where it is? Okay, so that's the end of mine. Sorry about that, that it took maybe longer than I thought, but I'll unshare my screen and we'll go from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick. And I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Rick that extend beyond this presentation, and his contact information is available to you. And I know that he sometimes will do a preliminary consult before he actually takes on a case. So keep that in mind as you move forward with these cases. It's always a balancing act, I'll just say, as a practitioner, between deciding, you know, whether it's worth it to hire an outside expert, depending on the nature of the injuries and liability issues and the like. But when you do decide to move forward, he's one of the people in the state that does a nice job. So we are now moving into the insurance section, and given that we are at the 12 o'clock mark, and given that Bob has some wonderful things to say about new forms of transportation, I'm going to keep my remarks very short and will be available to you all later on if people have questions post-presentation. I would just say that in regular bicycle and pedestrian cases, here are some things to keep in mind. First off, it's usually car insurance if it's a motor vehicle operator versus pedestrian or bicyclist. It's the car insurance that comes into play. Often with these types of cases, because people are so fragile and motor vehicles are so big, damages will exceed main minimum insurance policies. So you're often looking at UIM. A lot of these cases, you are dealing with Medicare or main care. So when you're looking at these cases and doing intake and analysis and you're dealing with liens and the like, know that you have to be looking very carefully, not only at the auto policies and any UIM or UM policies or any other policies that come into play because of auto insurance or homeowners insurance, but it's equally important to get all the policies for your client that deal with health insurance and subrogation rights, to fully understand Medicare lien repayment obligations as well as set-aside obligations. And so it's not a simple cut and dry thing when you get these cases, and especially when you're dealing with someone who is Medicare eligible. So I'll just say that always available to answer questions, but super, super important to analyze the policies at play. So Bob is gonna talk to us now about some of these issues that we're seeing with newer forms of transportation. Just like with Airbnb and Uber and Lyft, some of the case law developed as we went. We're starting to see cases involving e-bikes, e-scooters, and things popping up around the country, and insurance issues pertaining to those newer forms of transportation, and he is going to speak to those. So I'll turn it over to Bob O'Brien at Noyes, Hall & Allen Insurance.
Bob, you have to turn your mic on.
Mike, you're on mute.
There we go. Now we should be good. Thanks, Laurie. As she said, I'm Bob O'Brien from Noyes, Hall & Allen Insurance. I'm an agent, an insurance agent, and Noyes, Hall & Allen's an independent agency, which means we represent several companies. So my background is based on that, and so is my perspective. I'm also a bike commuter. I commute year-round, so I sort of have that background as well, and I certainly enjoyed the first part of this presentation. So the thing I wanted to talk about today was some new developments in transportation, and particularly with things like e-bikes and e-scooters and how insurance policies might respond to that. So I wanted to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that, that presentation there. So the primary issues that I wanted to talk about today are, obviously this stuff becomes important because of the growing popularity of things like electronic bikes, electric bikes, e-scooters, and that sort of thing. They're getting more popular all the time, particularly in an aging population like Maine. And also the growth of shared use networks. So if you've gone to other cities, you'll see scooters on the street available for rent by phone app or whatever. Boston, you'll see bike share network, and in many cities you'll see that. One of the big issues with insurance with these kinds of devices is that the public doesn't really think of them to be motor vehicles. They're not sold like motor vehicles. They are used casually like a bicycle or a scooter might be. And so you don't usually think of anything necessarily having to be done differently insurance-wise as a consumer. So a lot of them end up sort of falling between the cracks in the insurance world. So we want to talk a little bit about that today. Another issue is that insurance companies use different coverage forms. So most of the companies that we represent use ISO forms, and so that's the basis that I'm going to talk about here. But we always tell our agents here, and we always encourage our company adjusters to read the damn policy, so because it does make a difference. So And then the last factor with these types of devices is that the insurance industry is slow to adapt to technology, to social change. And of course, in some cases, it requires case law to, to really solidify. So you end up with different adjusters having different interpretations sometimes. So let's talk first about whether insurance is required for these kinds of devices. The short answer is that for e-bikes, for the e-scooters, powered skateboards, and those kinds of things, they're not required by state law to have liability insurance. Some larger bike type devices that have motors, think about like mopeds or small motorcycles, anything larger than that, required to have insurance, liability insurance. Mopeds 50 cc's and more typically have an insurance policy. So the next question is, what kind of insurance might apply to an accident, crash involving one of these devices, and pick up liability coverage for the operator? Would it be the auto insurance policy? Might it be another kind of personal liability policy like a homeowners or renters or condo owners? Maybe a personal umbrella policy, motorcycle or an RV policy, or even if you're using a shared use network, might their master policy step in and pick up? Let's look at the auto policy first. And there are three parts of the coverage that might apply to pick up the liability of a cycle operator. And one of them is the liability part, obviously. The next part is uninsured motorists or uninsured motorists. And the third part is your medical payments coverage, which covers the insured themselves, the operator themselves. Looking at the liability section, the ISO policy is pretty clear. There's a clear exclusion for operating any vehicle which has fewer than 4 wheels, and also a vehicle that's designed primarily for use off public roads. But typically your e-bike is a 2-wheeled vehicle, and so it would be excluded from the regular auto liability. So you're probably not going to find liability protection for the operator in the auto liability part. What about the UM part, where someone may be hit and the party that's responsible doesn't have enough coverage? Could I use my UM policy? We know that we can do that for a bicycle. But what about for an e-bike or some of these new types of transportation? The exclusion here is that motor vehicles that are being operated by the insured have to be listed on the policy to be covered by UM coverage. The problem is that the ISO policy, and a lot of the ones I've seen, don't define a motor vehicle. So what's a motor vehicle? You go back to basic Maine law definition, and the question becomes, is an e-bike a motor vehicle? And at this point, that's not been tested by Maine law that I know of. So would an insurance company exclude coverage for UM because they said it was a motor vehicle? Maybe. Would that be correct? Who knows? To be tested still, I think. So. Medical payments coverage is what you buy to cover your own injuries and injuries for people in your vehicle, or if you're a pedestrian and injured. And there's an exclusion in the MedPay clause of the policy for occupying a motor vehicle with fewer than 4 wheels. So again, motor vehicle is not defined in the MedPay section of the policy. So you run into that same sort of interpretation question as you do with UM and UIM. At this point, it's not tested. But again, certainly it's questionable whether your MedPay coverage would step in to cover you if you're riding one of these new types of vehicles. And so, we're really recommending to our customers that that you really shouldn't count on your insurance policy, your auto insurance policy, to provide you any coverage there. So let's take a look at your homeowner's policy. Homeowners, condo, renters, those forms are all pretty similar when you look at the liability part of the policy. And they're going to exclude coverage for operation of any motor vehicle. And the homeowner's policy does define a motor vehicle. In the homeowner's policy, it's defined as a self-propelled land or amphibious vehicle. So Maine law actually has 3 classes of e-bikes. There's a law that went into effect, I believe, last year. And there are 3 classes of e-bikes. The class 2 e-bike is a bike that can be self-propelled. It actually can operate without the operator pedaling at all. Class 1 and 3 bikes it's less clear whether those would be considered to be a self-propelled motor vehicle. So again, these things aren't defined. These vehicles weren't invented. These devices weren't invented when the policies were written. So it's really not clear whether these are considered to be self-propelled vehicles or not. E-scooters and skateboards, there is no mention in Maine law about whether these are considered vehicles or self-propelled or any of that. So the law is silent to my knowledge on that part. And so your insurance policy, would really have to be tested to find out whether your homeowner's exclusion for self-propelled vehicles would come into play there or not. Personal umbrella policies are, high liability limit policies. Some of them have uninsured motorist coverage in them, but many of them these days are what we call follow form policies, which means that they have the same exclusions and wording as the underlying policies do. And so generally, if your homeowner policy, the liability is excluded, then the umbrella is going to exclude it as well. Certainly, if an adjuster or an insurance company takes the position that it's excluded in that policy, they're going to take the same position on the umbrella if it's a following form policy. Another insurance that you might look to for covering these types of vehicles might be a motorcycle or an RV policy. And there are very few options at this point. Most insurance companies, one, don't write motorcycles or RVs like this. The ones that do don't have a class or a way to write little individual portable devices like an e-scooter or a powered skateboard. There are some specialty e-bike programs that some companies have put in place. But the ones we've seen generally have really low liability limits and low limits, and I wouldn't recommend them. A few sort of forward-thinking insurers have started to insure these e-bikes similar to motorcycles. They'll actually write them on the same kind of policy as a motorcycle. The one that I've seen, there is one that we represent here in Maine, and they'll write a liability limit up to $500,000 and also $500,000 of coverage. The drawback to this is that at this point, the insurance company still considers them to be like motorcycles. So you've got a vehicle that's really not like a motorcycle. It's not operated like a motorcycle. It doesn't get speed of motorcycles, but you're charging a rate that isn't all that dissimilar from what a scooter owner might pay for insurance. So it's comparatively expensive, but at least you can get decent limits with it, and that is the best option that we have in Maine anyway at this point for liability protection for folks who have these bikes. As I said, we get relatively few calls from people who ask about these things because they don't even think of them as being anything other than a bicycle that allows them to, go up hills where they maybe weren't capable or no longer capable of doing it themselves. So they're not thinking necessarily that this is even anything that's not covered by their regular insurance policy. If you've traveled to other cities, you've seen these bike shares, scooters, all kinds of things that are shared use networks. And as Laurie touched on earlier, they typically have a user agreement, which I'm sure most users have never even looked at. They just click agree and off they go. But of course, those are contracts, and those contracts typically have lots of releases, disclaimers, assumption of risk, all kinds of clauses in it that really benefit the shared use network and not the user who's using it. And the contracts that I've seen, which are only a few, really seem designed to sort of deny any liability on the part of the user network. So the best coverage that I can find right now for these kinds of things is on that motorcycle type policy. I can't find you anything for motorized scooter or motorized skateboard or those sorts of things, but e-bikes, we do have an option for. So at least there's some insurance option that's available that we didn't have even a year ago. So these things are developing as they go along. So happy to answer any questions if there are any, but that's sort of the lay of the land insurance-wise for some of these new types of devices.
So thank you, Bob, and I think that was really informative. I mean, I can't urge people enough, if they ride these types of bikes or know of people who ride these types of bikes, to look into the coverage piece, because I think, we're going to see, especially since a lot of older or more senior people here in the state are buying these bikes without thinking about this. We're going to be seeing this coming up more and more in the courtroom. But I'd prefer that proactively people start thinking about these types of things and getting the coverage that they need to protect themselves. If they, heaven forbid, hit a pedestrian with one of these bikes, they can do some serious damage. And given the multi-use on trail systems, that's an issue, but also to protect themselves in the event that, they're commuting. A lot of these e-bikes carry children, and people are using them to bring their kids to schools, and yet they don't realize that there might be an issue if their family is hit on one of these things. So to the extent you're aware of people using them, make sure they know about coverage, please, 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 just so that we can have people protected in the event of a tragedy. So if we don't have any questions for Bob, what I'd like to do is allow people to sign off, but we also have a main artist who created this really fabulous minute-long video about riding bicycles. And so I would love to share that with those of you who want to stick around. It's Oscar Boyson. His mother used to be the executive director of Bicycle Coalition of Maine. He's now doing film work either New York or California, but he created this video kind of in honor of his mother, and he's a Maine artist. So I'm gonna share that and end the presentation with that fun video if I can find it.
I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists and all of the folks who participated in the CLE. I hope it was, as you found it, as informative as I did. With that, I would say thank you very much, and enjoy Laurie's video.
Blaming me for the traffic? Hey, where do you think you're going? Morning. Meet the future. I
that?
Thanks, everyone.